Hello and welcome to this lesson today for the Judaism beliefs and teachings. Today's title is The Covenant with Abraham. Please write today's date and title in your book, remembering to underline it with a ruler. To start with, I'd like you to consider these four pictures on the screen. What do all these pictures have in common? Do any of these pictures carry a different meaning? Pause the video now to have a think about your ideas. Okay, on the screen we can see four images. We've got one image related to marriage, one related to a mortgage, one related to a will, something that a person will write to decide what will happen after they've died. And then in the bottom right, we've got some money. And what links these four images is that they are all related to a promise. On a wedding day, a couple will make a promise to each other. A mortgage is a promise between a new homeowner and a bank, where the homeowner promises to repay the bank their loan. A will is a promise to people's friends or family as to what they will receive after a person has died, and the money is a promise to pay the bearer of the money a particular amount. And if you look carefully at a £5 or £10 note, it will say the words promise. So today we're going to be looking at the Abrahamic covenant. So firstly, have a think about what you can remember from year 8 about covenant. Pause the video now and try and jot down in your book about 3 bullet points about what you can remember. Okay, maybe you came up with some of these ideas. It's a promise. Maybe you thought of Noah and the covenant between God and Noah. Maybe rainbow came to your mind after thinking about the flood and Noah, and the rainbow as an image of the covenant between God and humans. Maybe you thought of Abraham, his descendants, Isaac, the promised land. And we know from one of our key concepts that the definition of the covenant is the relationship of promise between God and the Jewish people, made with Noah, Abraham, and Moses. So what is a covenant? The word covenant means a serious and legally binding promise. A covenant creates a relationship. Covenants in Judaism are made with an oath, a promise, and they are backed up by actions, such as a sacrifice. In the book of Genesis, God makes a covenant, a promise, with Abraham, and this covenant created a relationship between God and Abraham, and also between God and the rest of the Jewish people. Now, historically, Abraham was born in the city of Ur in Mesopotamia in approximately 1800 BCE, nearly 4,000 years ago. And this is modern-day Iraq. And the story takes place in the book of Genesis, and it tells us that he was too old to have children with his wife Sarah, and Sarah was also too old to bear children. Here on the map we can see Egypt in the bottom left, and we can see the promised land in the center, just on the west of the eastern desert, and we can see all the way to the right at the end of the red line. And the red line shows us Abraham's journey from the start, from his hometown, all the way to the promised land in what is now Israel, near Jerusalem. So God makes a covenant with Abraham. What does God promise to Abraham? We know that God promises Abraham many descendants. We also know that he promises him a land to live on. So in Genesis 12, God asks Abraham to leave his hometown and says he will give him a land to live on. He promises Abraham many descendants and that he will make a great nation. He says that he will bless him and make his name famous. Later on, in Genesis 17, God makes the covenant between him and Abraham everlasting. It will be something passed down throughout the generations of his family, all the way to Jews today. So what is this sign of the covenant? This relates to an earlier lesson on Brit Milah. In Genesis 17, God also commands that there will be a sign of this covenant, a physical sign, and this sign will be circumcision. It says this: "Throughout your generations, every male among you shall be circumcised when he is 8 days old." We know not only the children, but also the slaves in the household of the Jewish people at that time should also be circumcised. So we know that the Jewish rite of passage that comes from this command from God is Brit Milah, circumcision. So God promised Abraham land, descendants, a great nation. God promised that he would bless Abraham and that he would make his name famous. Have a think about this. Why would the covenant be a good thing for the Jewish people? Pause the video now to think about your ideas. One way that it could be a good thing is that it could make them feel loved by God and motivate them to live in a good way. For example, keeping the commandments by following the mitzvah, or the mitzvot, plural. But are there any problems with making a covenant? Humans find it difficult to keep promises. Can you think of an example from the Torah? Pause the video now to have a think. One of the first examples in the Torah is when Adam and Eve failed to keep their promise not to eat the fruit in the Garden of Eden that God commanded them not to eat. Jews believe they are specially chosen by God to be his chosen people. And God made several covenants with people in the Torah, from Noah and Abraham, and then onto Moses, who we'll look at next lesson. Jews don't believe this makes them better than other people, but it gives them a special responsibility. Finish this. They aim to fulfill the mitzvah in the Torah. For example, pause the video now to finish that sentence. Now, this is a really important question for Jews today. Has God kept the covenant? Let's remember what Abraham was promised. Abraham was promised descendants. Abraham was given a son called Isaac, even though he and Sarah were very old. Isaac went on to have a family, and one of his sons, Jacob, had 12 sons. These became what was known as the 12 tribes of Israel. These families or tribes grew up into the Jewish nation. Since then, Judaism has expanded throughout the world, and since then has had millions of members throughout the world. God also promised that Abraham would have a famous name, and now today millions of people know who Abraham is. He is an important figure not just for Jews, but for Christians and Muslims as well. And God also promised Abraham a land, a promised land. Many Jews believe that God has kept this promise because there is now a Jewish state called Israel in the promised land. Jews believe that God gave them this. In Genesis 12, God asks Abraham to leave his hometown and says he will give him a land to live on. At the time, this promised land was called Canaan, and it is now called Israel after Jacob. Throughout history, the Jewish people have journeyed towards the promised land. Remember, after the Exodus in Egypt, the Israelites travelled from Egypt all the way to the promised land. Thousands of years after Abraham was promised this land, the Jewish state of Israel was created in 1948. Many Jews now live in Israel. Many moved back there after being persecuted in the Holocaust. And finally, let's look at the diversity. Not all Jews believe that they are the only ones who should live in Israel, the promised land. Some believe that the promised land should be shared with other people who have lived there throughout history, such as the Palestinians. Indeed, the Israel-Palestinian war and conflict is derived from this issue. Moreover, a small number of Reform Jews do not perform circumcision. Thank you for joining us today for our next lesson. Tomorrow we'll have our next lesson on the covenant with Moses.